We continue our study of Acts, and we are in Acts chapter 23. Before I forget, we are coming to the latter end of the study of this book, and so when we begin our new study, after we finish the book of Acts, we will be entering into a study of the first 5 books of the Bible, which is called by the Hebrews the Torah, and by scholars the Pentateuch. So it's not going to be necessarily a verse-by-verse study of all of the books. Some places we will go verse by verse, as we've been doing in our Sunday morning Bible class, but in some sections of the Pentateuch, we will, of necessity, go at a summary view. In other words, when we get to the genealogies particularly, and there's a lot of genealogies throughout the first 5 books, we're not necessarily going to go through all of those verse by verse. We'll simply hit the highlights of people that you would recognize and significant individuals that are mentioned. When we go through, say, the law section of the book of Leviticus, some of that repeats itself for various reasons. We won't necessarily go through those verse by verse, but we will simply go as an overview of some of those sections. So that's to give you an idea of what we're going to be doing. It will take up a good bit of our time as far as time frame is concerned, but I think it'll be a worthwhile study, especially Genesis. The book of Genesis is rich, as you know, and I'm looking forward to entering into that study with you. Acts chapter 23 is where we are today, though, and we left off with verse 12. When it was day, the Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves under an oath, saying that they would neither eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. These are assassins. These Jewish assassins had sworn that they would kill him no matter what. Now you think about that for a moment. The amount of deep-seated hatred, malice, and guile that is in someone's heart. To want to kill someone simply because they say something different from what they believe. Can you believe that? And yet that's what they did to Jesus. Jesus was killed because the Pharisees and the Sadducees could not stand what he was preaching and teaching. Now you come down to the 20th century. Surely nothing like that happened in the United States. Au contraire. There is a gospel preacher that is well known in the state of Arkansas by the name of Joe Blue. He has long since passed from this life. Joe Blue was one of the great preachers in the state of Arkansas for many years. He was also a debater, and he was stirring up the religious people in Arkansas so much that someone put dynamite in the pulpit where he was supposed to preach. They planned to blow him up. And the fuse didn't work. And it didn't blow up. And that pulpit stand, from what I understand, is in one of the congregations in Tupelo, Mississippi, of all places. Still looking like it did back then. Not only that, Joe Blue caught wind of the fact that when he was going to hold a gospel meeting in a certain place, that there was a man that said he was going to shoot him dead. So what did Brother Blue do? He didn't cancel the meeting. He went to that meeting that night, got up in the pulpit, didn't say a word, pulled out from his pocket a Colt 45 pistol, put it on the rostrum, and started preaching. No one made an attempt on his life. There are brethren who have gone through persecution in modern times to the extent of being killed simply because they preached and taught the truth. And that will always be the case until the Lord comes again to any extent. When here you have the Apostle Paul coming under threat from this very thing. Verse 13, Luke adds, there were more than 40 who formed this plot. Get that picture. 40 Jewish assassins are prepared to kill Paul, and they're not going to eat or drink until they have finished the job. They came to the chief priests and the elders and said, "We have bound ourselves under a solemn oath to taste nothing until we have killed Paul. Now therefore, you and the council notify the commander to bring him down to you, as though you were going to determine his case by a more thorough investigation. And we, for our part, are ready to slay him before he comes near the place." They enter into a conspiracy with the Sanhedrin. They're ready to carry this thing out. But this thing couldn't be kept secret. Verse 16, the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush, and he came and entered the barracks and told Paul. So Paul has someone there that overhears all of this. They don't know his connection to the apostle. He then goes and tells the apostle what's going to happen. Paul called one of the centurions to him and said, "Lead this young man to the commander, for he has something to report to him." This is Paul's only hope of getting out of this. His only hope of escaping this is doing what he's doing. So he took him and led him to the commander and said, "Paul the prisoner called me to him and asked me to lead this young man to you, since he has something to tell you." The commander took him by the hand, and stepping aside, he began to inquire of him privately, "What is it that you have to report to me?" That's smart, by the way, on his part. Taking the young man aside privately to talk to him. Don't take this man's word for it. Let's hear it straight from his mouth. And so, he said, "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down tomorrow to the council, as though they were going to inquire somewhat more thoroughly about him. So do not listen to them. For more than 40 of them are lying in wait for him, who have bound themselves under a curse, not to eat or drink until they slay him. And now they are ready and waiting for the promise from you." Now this commander is realizing that he's got a big problem on his hands. He's got to take care of this thing the best way he could. So the commander let the young man go, instructing him, "Tell no one that you have notified me of these things." That's to protect that young man and to protect Paul. The man that can do something about it knows. The young man has fulfilled his duty. He can go on now, and his life will not be taken. The commander has it in his power to take care of this. Yes, sir? That's right. Jesus told the 12, or the 11 at that time, because Judas had departed, that very thing. And I'm sure he told Paul the exact same thing too when he was training him to be an apostle. So this was nothing new, but it is something that had to be taken care of. So, verse 23, he called to him 2 of the centurions and said, "Get 200 soldiers ready by the 3rd hour of the night to proceed to Caesarea with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen." Get this number. 470 soldiers. 470 to guard Paul. You think the centurion had a good character and the commander had a good character? You better believe they did. 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, 200 spearmen. To put it in the southern vernacular, there ain't nobody going to be able to get to him through those men. Excuse the poor grammar. They are also to provide mounts to put Paul on and bring him safely to Felix the governor. And he wrote a letter having this form: "Claudius Lysias, to the most excellent governor Felix, greetings. When this man was arrested by the Jews and was about to be slain by them, I came up to them with the troops and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman." That's pretty funny. If you remember, what Luke's text actually tells us is that he was actually about to scourge Paul. He actually had him stretched out, ready to beat the truth out of him when he was told the truth. And then he realized, I got to do something about this. So, that's good. He's not mentioning that. He's simply saying this man was falsely accused. Verse 28, "And wanting to ascertain the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council. And I found him to be accused over questions about their law, but under no accusation deserving death or imprisonment. When I was informed that there would be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, also instructing his accusers to bring charges against him before you. If the centurion had not been concerned for Paul's life, he would have let Paul go, and he would not have sent him on to Felix. But he realized that if he let Paul go, Paul's life would be over. He'd be killed. So the soldiers, in accordance with their orders, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. But the next day, leaving the horsemen to go on with him, they returned to the barracks. Outside of the city, Paul wasn't in any more danger. There was no more need for that show of protection. When these had come to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they also presented Paul to him. When he had read it, he asked from what province he was, and when he learned that he was from Cilicia, he said, I will give you a hearing after your accusers arrive also, giving orders for him to be kept in Herod's Praetorium. This was for Paul's protection. In other words, we're going to bring your accusers here. We're going to hear them out. We're going to hear your side, but it's going to be in a safe place. Herod's Praetorium was built by Herod the Great. Herod the Great was responsible for a lot of building projects in and around Judea. And many of those buildings, many of those edifices still stand today. That was his lasting monument of his rule. Of course, we know that Herod the Great ordered the slaughter of the innocents in the city of in the town of Bethlehem, and he was also completely insane in ways. He had his own wife killed, his own mother killed. Someone that does that has got something loose in the head. Well, Herod the Great had a lot of great buildings, yes, but he was completely evil. But this is where it's going to be. Now, before we get in chapter 24, is there any questions or comments before we move on?
Paul was accused of a lot of things, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. Yes, he was. And the Lord knew that that would be the case, and he also knew that Paul was uniquely qualified to be able to fulfill the office that he was in, that is, the apostle to the Gentiles. All right, we'll move into chapter 24. After 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders, with an attorney named Tertullus. And they brought charges to the governor against Paul. After Paul had been summoned, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying to the governor, since we have through you attained much peace, and since by your providence reforms are being carried out for this nation. What he says here was to butter up the governor, of course. But what he says, what Tertullus says about the governor is true. Felix had restored peace to the surrounding countryside during his reign, during his tenure as governor. So what he's saying is exactly right. But now notice, we acknowledge this in every way and everywhere, most excellent Felix, with all thankfulness. But that I may not weary you any further, I beg you to grant us, by your kindness, a brief hearing. In other words, he's following the order that they should go through in hearings before Roman governors, Roman officials. Now he brings up his accusations. There are 3 accusations that Tertullus makes against Paul. Here's the first one. For we have found this man a real pest, and a fellow who stirs up dissensions among all the Jews throughout the world. That's the number 1 accusation. He's a pest. And he stirs up the Jews throughout the world. Number 2, a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He's a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. And number 3, he even tried to desecrate the temple. And then we arrested him. So the 3 accusations. He's a fellow who stirs up dissension among the Jews, and by the way, he's a pest. Number 2, he's a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. And number 3, he tries to desecrate the temple. And because of that, we arrested him. That's the bulk, that's the gist of their accusations against him. But Lysias, it says we wanted to judge him according to our own law, but Lysias, the commander, came along and with much violence took him out of our hands, ordering his accusers to come before you. And to this I would say, right, right. That's not how Luke describes it. Luke doesn't describe it this way at all. With much violence, he took Paul out of their hands. Who was turning violent on that occasion? It sure wasn't the Romans and the Roman soldiers. It was the mob that was demanding that Paul be killed. They listened to him up to the point where he mentioned the word Gentiles, and when he mentioned that word, Gentiles, it just started them off. And they were ready to kill him. They were going to tear him apart, in fact. So who was doing the violence? Sure wasn't the Romans. So that's a false accusation right there. Ordering his accuser to come before you. By examining him yourself concerning all these matters, you will be able to ascertain the things of which we accuse him. The Jews also joined in the attack, asserting that these things were so. They're telling Felix, just listen to him. Let him talk. And when he says something to you, you'll know that what we're saying is true. They've opened themselves up to a world of hurt because they didn't know Paul very well. When the governor had nodded for him to speak, Luke tells us exactly the procedure that's followed here. The attorney gets up, makes his accusation, he sits down, the governor then acknowledges Paul. Paul then will be there and he makes his defense. Paul responded, knowing that for many years you have been a judge to this nation, I cheerfully make my defense. The Jews were expecting Paul to sort of be reticent and him and haw. Again, they didn't know Paul very well. Paul says, I'm cheerfully make my defense. I'm glad to be here to be able to tell you the truth. Since you can take note of the fact that no more than 12 days ago I went up to Jerusalem to worship. He answers the sedition charge. I wasn't trying to stir up anything. I came there to worship. Neither in the temple nor in the synagogues nor in the city itself did they find me carrying on a discussion with anyone or causing a riot. That answers the second charge. Nor can they prove to you the charges of which they now accuse me. That covers everything else. It says they can't offer any proof. They've given you accusations, but if you look at the truth of it, none of those accusations hold up. But this I admit to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, I do serve the God of our fathers, believing everything that is in accordance with the law and that is written in the prophets. He said, these men call the way, that's what the Lord's church was called by and large at this point, the way which they call a sect. A sect. The sect that is everywhere spoken against, we would say. There are people today, and even some of my brethren, that still call the Lord's church a sect. A sect. You know, at one time, all of our preachers in the brotherhood would talk about the sectarians, and everyone knew who they were talking about. I remember when I was a little boy, and I had heard my grandfather preach, and I heard him talk about the sectarians. The sectarians. And I was sitting at the table with him at breakfast. We were visiting that weekend, and I said, Grandpa, what does sectarian mean? And he began to explain to me what sectarian was. Denominationalism, denominations, the denominational concept of the church. He explained it very clearly to me. Someone that is promoting their philosophy, their belief, their religion, and not promoting the way of the New Testament. That was ingrained into my mind at an early age because I firmly believe that's what the New Testament teaches. My grandfather explained it from the New Testament, and he was right. I still think he was right. The sectarians, true sectarianism is nothing more than man-made religion. Denominationalism, denominational thinking, denominational preaching. And so what Paul is saying is, they are calling the way a sect. But he said, I do serve the God of my fathers. In other words, they're throwing this charge out, and I'm simply worshiping according to truth. And he says that everything in accordance with the law and is written in the prophets, in other words, backs up what Paul is doing. The law and the prophets foretold this day, in other words. When we get into our study of the first 5 books of the Bible, we're going to see that. Even beginning as early as Genesis 3, talking about the seed of the woman crushing the seed of the serpent. And when we get into the book of Deuteronomy, Moses talks about the one who would rise after him. And him shall ye hear in all things whatsoever he'll say to you. Those books and the prophets point toward someone, the Messiah. And it also points toward the kingdom that would be established in the top of the mountains, in the city of Jerusalem, in the latter days. And that actually did happen. So he says, everything that's in the law and the prophets points to this. Having a hope in God, which these men cherish themselves, that there shall certainly be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. Again, he points to that age-old question between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Will there be a resurrection of the righteous and the wicked? Now, in our modern day, our brethren and those in religion that promote the 80-70 thinking say that there's not going to be a final resurrection of the righteous and wicked. They've got to deal with what Paul says here. Paul says clearly there will be, certainly be, he says, a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. He's not talking about the resurrection of a cause. He's not talking about the resurrection of the church from Judaism in AD 70. He's talking about the final resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. In view of this, he says, I also do my best to maintain always a blameless conscience, both before God and before men. Remember what he had said earlier? Men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day. And for that he was struck in the mouth by one of the attendants of the high priest. But here he repeats that before these men who were there present when he said it, and now he's repeating it before Felix. He says, I exercise myself, do my best, the New American Standard reads. I do my best to maintain always a blameless conscience. That's something that all of us should strive to have. A blameless conscience. Paul talks about that extensively in Romans chapter 14. Matters of conscience. Things that we do for conscience sake. And that we must not violate our conscience. Because if we do, we're sinning. If we violate our conscience, if we do something that we know is not right, then we're violating our conscience and we're sinning in and of itself for that. And that's talking about, of course, matters of no consequence. But still, he says, I always strive to have a blameless conscience before God and before men. When Paul was in Judaism, he thought he was doing right. He wasn't violating his conscience. Then he was taught the truth, and he obeyed the gospel. After he became a child of God, he never violated his conscience. He always did what he knew to be right and was not going to go against that. That's something that our young people need to know. Not to violate their conscience. If they're presented with a situation that they know isn't right, don't go against what you know to be right and wrong. And that's something that all of us older folks ought to know to do as well. We ought to know better than what some of us do and what some choices that we make. We must never violate our conscience. Because if we do, we're sinning against ourselves. And we need to make sure that we don't, of course, violate the will of God either. Having a blameless conscience both before God and before men. Now, after several years, I came to bring alms to my nation and to present offerings. That answers the third specific charge against Paul made by the lawyer Tertullus, in which they found me occupied in the temple, having been purified, without any crowd or uproar. I did all this. There's no uproar. There's no crowd. Didn't stir up anything, contrary to what this man has just told you. But there were some Jews from Asia who ought to have been present before you and to make accusation if they should have anything against me. Notice, these men weren't there. They didn't show up. That speaks volumes as to their veracity, doesn't it? They weren't there to make these charges before Felix. They didn't think it was going to get that far. They thought that Paul would already be dead. He'd already be gone. The problem in their eyes would already be eliminated. Nope, that's not what happened. Or else let these men themselves tell what misdeed they found when I stood before the council. Other than for this one statement, which I shouted out while standing among them, for the resurrection of the dead, I am on trial for you today. Party jealousy was the reason that Paul was brought before the council, and that Paul was now standing before Felix, being accused. Jealousy. Yes, sir.
Here's a comment. Jesus was an activist. Paul was an activist. Remember Matthew 10:34. Think not that I came to send peace on the earth. I came not to send peace, but a sword. For I came to set a man at variance against his father and the daughter, against the mother and the daughter, and the law against the mother-in-law, and a man's throat shall be led with his own household. So Paul was an activist. Jesus was an activist. We're supposed to be activists. We're supposed to contend earnestly for the faith, which was once for all delivered to the Son.
Well, the preached message would be what would stir up the problem. It wasn't that the Lord wants us to be activists for activism's sake. The Lord wants us to preach and teach the truth and live right, and when we do that, it's going to stir up trouble for us. So in that sense, we're going to have problems. We're going to have opposition. And that's in part what's going on here. Paul's preaching the truth. Paul is living right, and there are people that can't stand it. There are people that can't stand that one iota. And we've got to simply be resolute, as Paul was, simply do what's right, teach what's right, preach what's right, and then let the consequences come as they will. Any other comments, questions before we move forward?
One more quick one. Do we recognize them? They're out there. Do we recognize them?
Do we recognize what?
The people that can't stand the truth.
Well, I think it's pretty clear once people oppose the truth. It's pretty clear once they do, what they're doing, and normally why they're doing it. What we've got to do is simply do what's right, say what's right, live what's right, and that way it speaks for itself. Verse 24, but some days later, Felix arrived with Drusilla, his wife who was a Jewess, and sent for Paul and heard him speak about faith in Christ Jesus. Interesting, Drusilla is a daughter of Herod Agrippa. So she's familiar with the Old Testament. She's familiar with the law of Moses. She knows about these things of which they're discussing. But as he was discussing righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix became frightened, the New American Standard says. The King James says Felix trembled. Same thing, both statements convey the same thing. Felix was frightened. He was terrified, we would say. And said, go away for the present, and when I find time, I will summon you. King James says, when I find a more convenient season, I will call for thee. Felix had to hear this sermon. What we know about Felix indicates that what Paul preached was exactly what he needed. Notice what he preached about. He preached about righteousness. Felix was not a righteous man. Felix, like many Romans, was a hedonist. He gave over to his passions, to his lusts. Self-control related to that. Felix had no self-control when it came to certain areas of his life. And the judgment to come. Paul wasn't talking about 80-70. He was talking about final judgment. This lesson, this message would have had no impact on Felix if what Paul was talking about is the destruction of Jerusalem in 80-70 by the Romans. Why would that make Felix frightened? It wouldn't. It would give him courage. Oh, we're going to prevail over the Jews. Nope. He was talking about the judgment to come. Final judgment. I have seen, and I'm sure Steve can echo this, in preaching the gospel in gospel meetings or in local work, you preach a sermon about the judgment, and sometimes you'll see someone during the invitation song standing and gripping the pew in front of them and their knuckles turning white. They know they've got to make a change, and for whatever reason, they don't. They're fighting it. They're fighting making that change and responding to the invitation. And it's always a sad thing to witness. And then, of course, you've got those that know when the truth is preached and the prospect of final judgment is held out in front of them. They know, I've got to make a change now while I've got time and make sure that I'm living right and make sure that my Lord's happy with me, and then make that change. But here, Felix doesn't. He was frightened. He trembled. He was shuddering. Have you ever seen someone so afraid, so frightened that their just body begins to shake? That's where Felix was. Felix knew what Paul was preaching was right. He already heard to an extent some things from his own wife Drusilla because she was a Jewess and she was familiar with the Old Testament. He already knew some of these things. But Paul presented it in such a way that held out the prospect of eternity before him in a way that he had never considered before. But what is his response? Go away. Go away. Go away for now. And when I find time, when I have a more convenient season, I will call for you. As far as we know, that convenient season never came. As far as we know, Felix never obeyed the gospel. As far as we know, Drusilla never obeyed the gospel. They did not heed the message that Paul preached. It would not be the first time, nor will it be the last time that someone refuses to respond to the invitation that's given, that needs to respond. Of course, I have had individuals in the past who have responded to the invitation who were completely insincere. I can tell you a couple of stories in particular. One in which a young lady responded to the invitation to be baptized. She was in tears, crying, knowing that conveying to me that she needed to do something. And turned out the only reason why she obeyed the gospel is to marry an elder son there at the church because she needed the health insurance to cover the pregnancy that was about to take place. She told me that later on, lying through her teeth. All she did was get wet. She didn't obey the truth. That's the one circumstance of so many over the years that just sticks out in my mind. The vast majority obeyed the gospel and are sincere and are faithful children of God, and that one incident has stood out in my mind all these years. That happened in 1989, 1990. I don't know what happened to her after that. She divorced her husband, and a tragic situation for him and for that good family. But she was lying through her teeth about it. Yet Felix didn't lie. He didn't lie. He just said, go away. Yes, sir.
Do you think today there's a lot of denominations that the top leaders has been talked to by faithful men and have actually maybe broken into their conscience?
I think
Following of the big following that a lot of denominations have realized what we're going to take or what's happening.
I think so. It's been over the years that that our brethren have actually talked to the leaders of certain religious groups and have had conversations with them about religion, about the Bible, about salvation, and about baptism. And some of those men will acknowledge the truth of what's being said and won't do anything about it because of their position, because of the consequences that would come if they made a change. And that's a sad thing. That is a truly sad thing to witness and to know about. But we cannot stop talking to them. Yes, sir. Almost but lost. One of the greatest invitation songs that has ever been written, based upon this sad statement about Felix. Almost cannot avail. Almost is but to fail. Sad, sad, that bitter wail. Almost but lost. That's Felix. Yes, sir.
Most people, like Felix, are more interested in maintaining the status quo than obeying the gospel.
Too many are. There's some that will accept the truth and obey it. I'm thankful to this day that my grandfather saw the truth and didn't fight it. He didn't resist it. When he saw finally that he was wrong, he accepted it. He obeyed the gospel. And because of his one decision, it affects me to this day. I wouldn't be standing here. I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if he hadn't done what he did. And you can say the same. Many of you in this audience can say the same thing about your backgrounds, about the people that made those decisions in your case that has affected you to this day. I'm thankful for the men and the women who, when they saw the truth, they obeyed it without a question, without hesitation. When they finally saw, I'm wrong, this is right, I've got to make a change. They were like Paul on the road to Damascus. When he saw and realized the truth, he went into the city, and Ananias told him, arise, be baptized, wash away your sins, calling on the name of the Lord. He did it and didn't hesitate. And the church was better off for it. No doubt about it. And what the challenge is for us, brethren, is that we use all at our disposal with the contacts that we have every day with our friends, family, co-workers, whoever it is, our neighbors, and that we try to influence them to see and to obey the truth. If we can do that, if we can just win one soul to Christ, it's been worth all the effort. If we can win one soul back who's fallen away, then it would have been worth all the effort. That's our number one primary mission in this life, is to evangelize and to win souls back to the Lord. And if we concentrate our efforts in that, in our own personal lives, the church will be far better for it and will be strengthened for it. So, verse 26, Luke adds, at the same time too, he was hoping that money would be given him by Paul. Therefore, he also used to send for him quite often and converse with him. So Luke adds here that Felix was wanting Paul to offer him a bribe so he could let him go. That wasn't going to happen. Paul wasn't going to offer a bribe. But then he also tells us that he continued to send for Paul. He liked to hear Paul preach. He enjoyed conversing with him. But he never changed. He never did what he needed to do to obey the gospel. But notice verse 27. After 2 years had passed. This goes on for 2 years. 2 years. Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus. And wishing to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul imprisoned. So he leaves Paul in prison, doesn't let him go. This 2-year period, 2-year plus period, is the most inactive period of Paul's career. He's there in a prison. He's not writing any letters to any individuals or any churches. All he's doing is he's being let out on occasion to go talk to Felix until Felix is replaced by Festus. And then he's kept in prison. So this is the most inactive period of his entire preaching career. He's not going to churches. He's not going to areas to preach. He's simply stuck there in prison. But it's all for the greater good, because the Lord has in mind still. He's already told him, you will go to Rome. Paul has been assured he will go to Rome. So Paul knows all this is going to work out for the ultimate goal of going to Rome itself. So next Sunday morning, when we continue our study in chapter 25, We're going to be entering into a period of time beginning at 59 A.D. We've skipped forward in time. 59 A.D., the events that take place beginning in chapter 25. So that's where we'll take up with our study.